I just have some slides and some facts and some ideas to discuss. I'm just really looking forward to the discussion part. As Jared said, I'm one of the authors of the IPCC. There's many of them. I'm going to be showing you some results from the IPCC and some results from other papers, including mine. Every time on each slide that I show something, there should also be a link or a reference. So that's just normal good practice. So you can look things up for yourself as to what the academic paper is that information comes from. So I basically want to just do 4 different directions. So talking a bit about the climate crisis, what are the consequences, what are the causes, and maybe some causes in history. We're going to be looking at emissions and inequality. And I'll tell you some about my research on living well within limits. So can we live well within much less? Can we live well within planetary boundaries? And maybe some ideas on what you might be able to do. So in terms of the context, I know that you're in the UK, and in the UK you had one of the hottest summers ever. That was not a coincidence. So because of climate change, there were heat waves and droughts all over the northern hemisphere, so across Eurasia and in North America. And these are just some pictures of dried out rivers around the world, from China to the Danube. This is an old Nazi ship that was sunk and now reappeared in the Danube. And obviously there's been mega floods in Pakistan. So we have, the drought, heat waves, and droughts, and then floods. This is all very extreme weather, and it's all very much due to climate change. So what we're trying to do when we study it scientifically is we have the IPCC, and the IPCC stands for Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the IPCC is a big and somewhat complicated organization. It's basically a whole bunch of scientists, and we're divided into 3 working groups, and that means that we come out with 3 reports. Also, sometimes we come out with special reports. These are all available on the IPCC's website that you can find very easily. The first working group, normally you can see my little mouse, is on the physical science basis. The second working group is on impact, adaptation, and vulnerability. And the third working group, which is the one that I'm in, is on mitigation of climate change. That means trying to make it less worse, like trying to stop it. And so these are the 3 working groups, and I'm going to be showing you results, I think, from all 3. It should be clear on the slides. And we abbreviate the working groups as working group 1, working group 2, working group 3. So that's what I'm going to be showing you a bit about. So this is a figure from the summary for policymakers. It's the 6th figure from the summary for policymakers, and it's just going to show from working group 1, and working group 1 is on the physical science basis. And what you can see here is that we're able to predict, or the colleagues who do the natural science stuff are able to predict the frequency of extreme weather events as they go along at different levels of warming. And so let's just focus on the plot that's on the left-hand side of the screen, I hope for everybody. Which basically says what would be an extreme hot temperature over land. That would be a once every 10-year event in the pre-industrial era. So that's 1850 to 1900. That's almost pre-industrial. So that would be a once every 10-year event. At 1 degree, which is already in our past, sadly, it would be 3 times every 10 years. At 1.5 degrees, which is where we're heading roughly by 2030, it would be 4 times every 10 years. At 2 degrees, it would be 6 times every 10 years. And at 4 degrees of warming, which is somewhere I definitely hope we're not going to get to, it would be 9 times every 10 years. And that's shown by the bright red dots as opposed to the pale ones. And so what this says is that the physical science, in terms of what we can expect in terms of heat waves, for instance, is actually quite good in terms of saying this is where we're heading. And we're heading to very, very dangerous, we're heading towards temperatures where what used to be an outlier, what used to be an extreme event, is now going to become very common. Already at 1.5 degrees, a 1 in a 10-year event happens every 4 times every 10 years, almost half the time. In particular, when we can also try to estimate what the impact, I don't know if I should be looking at the chat as well. I guess not. I won't look at the chat. Oh, sorry about
it's
that.
mostly just safeguarding things. So yeah, don't worry. And
okay, if any question shows up in the chat, just let me know.
Yeah, Jared and Emily will put them to you at the end if that
okay.
works. Perfect.
Yeah, that works fine. Okay, so we can also learn about the impact on biodiversity. So quite often people say, oh, the climate is one thing and biodiversity is another, but they're actually very much joined. And that's something that I'm very happy to talk about more in the Q&A. They're joined in terms of causes and in terms of consequences. So in terms of consequences, there's actually a study that estimated how many species would lose half of their geographic range due to warming by 2100. And what you can see is that, for instance, for vertebrates, if a species loses half of its range, it's considered at risk of extinction. So you can see that vertebrates, at 1.5 degrees, you would have 4% of all vertebrate species at risk of extinction. For plants, it would be 8%, and for insects, it would be 6% at 1.5 degrees. At 2 degrees, it already goes up a lot. So even though 0.5 degrees doesn't sound like much, it actually doubles the risk of extinction for both vertebrates and plants. And for insects, it triples it. And by the time we get to 3.2 degrees, we have a quarter of vertebrates and almost half of plant and insect species being at risk of extinction. And so the point is that this is very devastating for biodiversity, and this is a future we really do not want to live in, because we depend on plants, insects, and animals for our lives as well. So we really want to be able to live on a planet that supports good levels of biodiversity. So what temperature are we currently headed for? So on our current trajectory, we're actually headed for 3.2 degrees. So this is some plot that's just showing global CO2 emissions. So the CO2 emissions are the main driver of greenhouse gases. They're the main kind of heating gas our societies emit into the atmosphere. And on our current trajectory, where we're headed based on what we're doing now and what our governments have promised to do, we'd be heading for 3.2 degrees, which is basically the worst case scenario that was in the previous slide. So this is very bad indeed. And so we really need to act on our governments and our societies to bring that down, to bring emissions down much faster than they're currently planning on doing it. And one thing that's really important to understand is that this is despite the fact that most governments in the world signed up to what's called the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement would keep us to 1.5 degrees, which is the green trajectory, or definitely well below this yellow curve, which is roughly 2.4 degrees. So it would keep us really way down. And we're currently sort of closer to following the red curve, or something that goes a little bit lower to 3.2 degrees. So, so governments, despite the fact that they signed up to the Paris Agreement, are really not actually doing the things necessary for the Paris Agreement to happen. They're not doing the things necessary to keep temperatures down for the next century. So we've left the Holocene, and if you're like me, you didn't know what the Holocene is or was. I only learned about it, in the last sort of 10 years, so I did not learn it at school. The Holocene is the last time, the era of geological time after the last ice age. So in the past, we had ice ages, and after the last ice age, the 12,000 years since the end of the last ice age, that was the Holocene. And the Holocene temperature range, you can see on this plot, is the pink temperature range, and it's quite narrow. It's only a degree. It goes from like minus 0.25 to 0.75. So it's really this narrow little band of warm temperature, which was the Holocene. And unfortunately, we've already left that because of the level of emissions of greenhouse gases we've put into the atmosphere. So we're already beyond Holocene temperatures. And that's very dangerous, because the Holocene is where we developed things like agriculture. So all the plants that we depend on for eating were developed during this very sort of narrow, stable, warm temperature of the Holocene, not in the hotter temperatures we're heading for. And one of the things we have to think about is what's causing this. And one of the things that's causing this is the fact that the fossil fuel industry has kept us using their products. The fossil fuel industry knew for decades. Right now, we know that they were first informed about climate change and their role in causing it in the 1950s. It's a very long time ago, so 70 years ago, roughly. But I just want to show you a plot that's going back to 1982 because it shows so clearly that they knew exactly what they were doing and they knew exactly what future they were pushing us into. This is a plot that was from an internal report from Exxon. Now is a bigger company called ExxonMobil. They're one of the biggest fossil fuel companies. And what you can see is on this plot, it's a bit complicated. So I'll just explain. You have years on the horizontal axis, so that's time. And on the vertical axis, you have how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. So if this part goes up, it means there's more and more warming gases in the atmosphere. And on the right-hand side, you have temperature. So this plot was made by somebody who knew exactly that putting more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would mean putting the temperature up. And they were bang on in terms of their predictions as to where we'd be in terms of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, so how much warming gas we'd put in. And they are slightly off in terms of the temperature, but pretty close because they're actually using a different baseline. So that means that they knew exactly what they were doing at that time already 40 years ago. So 40 years ago, they knew what future they were pushing us into. They knew that they were going to be pushing us out of the Holocene and that this was very dangerous, but they decided to do it anyway. Right around that time, Exxon, along with the other fossil fuel companies, fired all their climate scientists and started spending millions in disinformation. And we are very much still, so they basically tried to promote climate denial, even though they knew that climate change was really happening. So what are the main physical causes and economic causes of global warming? So the main drivers are greenhouse gas emissions. So these are the warming gases that basically every year we emit them. They sort of envelop the earth like another layer of blanket. So we're just putting more and more layers of blankets around the earth. And so the earth is heating up. And so most of it, about 2/3 of it is carbon dioxide. And there's carbon dioxide from land use change, that's the yellow bit, methane, which is from agriculture, and fossil fuels, nitrous oxides, which is purely from agriculture, and some extra stuff called fluorinated gases. So those are the physical quantities that are making the planet warmer and warmer, because every year, as you can see, we're putting more and more and more of the stuff in the atmosphere. Where does that come from in terms of economic sectors? That's maybe more interesting. So this is a plot that shows exactly the same thing, but that divides up the greenhouse gas emissions by where they come from in economic sectors around the world. And you can see that 1/3 of it, the biggest share, is from the energy systems. Then there's industry, which is orange. AFLU is agriculture, forestry, and other land use. So it's basically land-based processes. That's about 1/5. Then there's transport, which is 14%, and buildings, which are 6%. And of course, what you have to understand is that nobody uses energy because they want to use energy. The energy system is delivering energy to buildings, to transport, and to industry. So it gets redistributed to the other sectors because they're the ones using it. So one of the things that's really important to understand is that not everybody uses the same amount of stuff in the world, and not everybody emits the same amount of greenhouse gases. So we have a lot of inequality in this climate change system. And this is just one plot that explains it pretty well. That shows how much carbon dioxide, which is the main greenhouse gas, the main warming gas, how much carbon dioxide is emitted in tons by different people with different incomes. And this is all around the world. So the top 1% income earners are the top 1% around the world, wherever they live. And you can see that they have emissions that might be around, the 1% might have emissions that would be around maybe 75 tons per person. The top 10% would have emissions around 25 tons per person. The middle, so the middle 40%, it's already much lower. It's less than 10%, maybe it's around 6. And maybe 6 tons per person. And the bottom half, the poorest half of the world only emits maybe 1 ton per person. And so that means that it's really very, very, very unequal. And what that means in terms of global shares is that the top 1% of richest people on the planet emit about 15%. That's what's shown in the circle. The circle plot is this 15%. And the top 10% of income earners emit about half of all carbon dioxide. the bottom half, the poorest half of the world's population only emits about 7% of CO2 emissions. So we have an extremely unequal situation here. And one of the things that's the most unfair about it is that the poorest people are hit the hardest by climate impacts, both because of where they live and because they don't have, very good living conditions, safe houses, good infrastructure to help them deal with things. So it's a very sort of unfair and unjust problem as well, because of the way it's caused and because of the way it impacts people. So what do we do about this? Can we think of a different way of doing things? And I just wanted to show you some sort of more positive and hopeful results, which have to do with whether or not it's possible to live well and use less energy. So one of the main reasons that we have climate change is because we're using lots of energy, lots of fossil fuels. Can we use less and still live well? And this is a model that's based on the decent living energy theory of Professor Narasimha Rao, who's at Yale University, who's also a friend and a colleague. And what you can see here, and I hope you can see it, I hope this thing's not annoying. Can you see I hope you don't see the black bar too badly. Anyway, I hope it's allowing you to see my actual screen. But what you can see is that these are sufficient energy services per person. So we're basically calculating how much nutrition, space, clean water, communication, mobility, health, and education any person would need, depending on if they're an adult or if they're a child, depending on if they live in a rural setting, they need to go to have more transport, or if they live in a city, they might not need as much miles per year to get around, kilometers per year. Everybody has a mobile phone. There's one laptop per household. So this is not like a low-tech, it's not a low-tech model. Everybody has appliances and so on. And this is what our model looks like, but maybe that's not so interesting. We're basically calculating up everything, and not just the direct energy that's used in people's activities, but also all the embodied energy, all the energy that goes into making a phone, a computer, a vehicle, etc. And we're also modeling private consumption, offices, stores, public consumption, hospitals, schools, and all the infrastructure that goes into houses and roads and all of that stuff. So really trying to calculate everything. And what do we find? We find that the globe, so what we're measuring is, or what we're modeling is global final energy use, which because it's global is measured in an astronomical unit. It's very large. EG stands for exajoule. And you can see that right now around 220, we're probably around 400 something exajoules, which is a huge amount, but it's for the whole world. And you can see that the IEA, which is the International Energy Agency, they have different scenarios. Their reference scenario, everything just keeps on growing. Then they have some scenarios where you try to stay at 2 degrees or maybe below 2 degrees of warming, where you sort of stabilize energy use. But it stays in their scenarios, either it's trying to climb up, almost to 600 exajoules, or it stays around 400. In our scenario, which is the DLE one, the decent living energy one, we calculate that you could satisfy everybody's needs at a decent level, really for everybody around the world, at 150 exajoules. So decent living energy for all could be achieved, given current technologies, at 40% of our current energy use, despite population growth. And so that tells us that a different future could be possible if we gave everybody access to efficient technology, efficient infrastructure, and we also got rid of overconsumption. So that's something that also doesn't exist in our model. And this result was considered important by the IPCC, and they've reflected the fact that we can deal with a lot of climate change by reducing overconsumption and giving everybody access to really efficient houses, efficient modes of transportation in a sufficient level. And just to, anyway, this is my research domain, so I think it's kind of cool. So I just wanted to also share this. This is a paper that's not by my group. It's by Jarmo Kikstra. It came out last year, and his colleagues. And it shows how much investment you need in order to be able to get to this efficient and sufficient society of the future, if we would ever get there. And you can see that you need a huge amount of investment. This here, it's calculated in the energy you would have to use to get it. So for shelter, for housing, you see this huge amount of investment you need to do for retrofitting houses or building safe, solid houses that are well insulated around the world. But then afterwards, once you've made that investment, you see that you're using much less energy on an annual basis. That's what the second plot shows is, there's 150 exajoules we'd use every year. Once we invest into shelter, we only have to use much less afterwards. So that's showing that investing in housing retrofit and efficient housing is really, really worth it. I think I'm not going to cover this one because it's going to take us too far. And I think I've already talked enough, and I want to get to the question part. So I did want us to just say a couple of words about what can you do, because I know we need to basically change everything yesterday in order to be safe. So we're already not in a safe space in terms of climate. So I just wanted to talk about that a bit. And I just wanted to share this plot, which I hope you see better than I do because of all the little Zoom windows above it. So it's from, I have the link there. It's from a group called Grand Gather. And I really like it. So basically it says, so you're ready to take action on climate change. And it says, first, do you know the basics? Well, if you don't know the basics, then you should go and read a bunch of things. You can read IPCC reports, or you can read other things as well. And then you go back. Okay, so you know the basics. Yes, but I'm very sad, and that's normal. And so they have resources around climate psychology and trying to understand how we can, still function and not be miserable because of this. And then there's another box that says, yes, but I'm really not really great at activism, which means doing stuff, trying to change things around me. And so then the question is, okay, how do we learn how to make ourselves into people who want to change things? And yes, but it's daunting, but I don't know where to start. And then we get to my favorite box, which is, are you a yes kind of person or a no kind of person? So I'm a no kind of person. I'm grumpy all the time. So then I would want to act on stopping bad things. But if you're a yes kind of person, you might want to build good things. And so that's sort of where I'll leave things. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julia. That was really interesting. I particularly like the bit about inequality and climate change, because it's interesting to find how adversely affected the people who are contribute least, which is quite empowering and I think motivating too. I think we've had a few questions come in. I'll just read out the first one. It's from Mark from a school in Sheffield, and he's also the host, which is also the host school for the 2022 Schools Climate Assembly. And he says, how can we achieve real change so that young people do not disengage from crucial work for climate justice?
So real change does happen sometimes, and there's real change happening sort of around us. There's something that I wanted to share with you, and maybe I can still find it. That just shows that we're in a very, very, very different space than we used to be in terms of climate action. There we go. So I am going to just take speaker's privilege and share my screen again, because I did want to share this slide with you. Which shows, so this is another figure. This is from the working group 3 of the IPCC, and it shows, for instance, the dropping cost of renewable energy. So renewable energy is solar, it's wind, it doesn't emit carbon dioxide. And what you can see is that it's getting cost competitive with fossil fuels. The fossil fuels range is shown in gray. So that's the fossil fuel cost in 2020, which has since gone up. And you can see that the cost per megawatt hour is actually of the photovoltaics, onshore wind and offshore wind is actually dropping below that, or certainly well within that. And so, and you can also see that the adoption, the deployment of photovoltaics, wind, onshore wind and offshore wind is just climbing like crazy. And so that's one of the things where that is real change that's happening. It means that it's much easier to work on climate now and to reduce emissions now than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago, when those technologies were more expensive, for instance. So change is happening. It's not happening fast enough, but some things are really going in the right direction. And I think that the way to keep working on it and not lose determination is because you don't know until just the day before you win that you're going to win. And you know, I'll give an example which is kind of timely, which is you know, some people might agree or might disagree with this example, but there's a politician in the US called Jay Inslee. He's governor of the state of Washington, which is a big state, but you know, not even one of the biggest. And he spent a lot of time trying to get climate legislation passed, and he couldn't do it. He tried and failed. He tried to have a carbon tax or a carbon price, and it didn't work. And the fossil fuel companies spent $20 million in this little state election and won. So they won, he lost. And since then, and then he was thinking about it, and he tried to come up with another idea. And his other idea was to have climate legislation and laws and policies that wouldn't be around costs, but would be around investment and doing things differently, like changing the economy and changing industry. And he tried to run for president on that basis and lost. That's why you've never heard of him. But the basis for his legislation just got passed in the US Congress a few weeks ago. So this huge policy package, probably one of the biggest that any country has ever done. It's not perfect by any means, but it's really based on his framework. And the reason it won votes was because he put all this thought into developing it. And so you can lose a lot of times before you win, but you're still going to win big if you keep at it. So I would just say, just keep trying and really try to learn from your mistakes, try to learn from other people's mistakes, and whatever you do, don't get discouraged because the stakes are too high for that. So we just have to keep trying, because one day you're going to win, or one day we're going to win.
I've got a question from me. A bit about your research. So when you're putting together your working groups, you're working with the mitigation of climate change. How closely do you work with other sectors? Sorry, was that clear?
So how closely do we work with other sectors, or how closely do we work with the other working groups? With the other working groups, sorry. So we try to work quite closely. So the way we do it is that we have, basically we're divided, and it's a very hierarchical organization. The IPCC is almost like the army, not quite. But we're divided up into, each working group has 2 bosses. Each working group is then divided up into like roughly 15 chapters, maybe 20 chapters. Each chapter has 2 bosses, and then each chapter has about 10 people working in it. And the way we do it is each chapter basically has pals in the other working groups, and we invite them to our meetings and we talk with them. And we're like, hey, we're having this problem. Who should we talk to? Who's dealing with this thing? Who knows about that? So we try to sort of continuously work with them. And then we also sign up as reviewers for each other's work. So the IPCC has, the way we make sure that we don't say complete random nonsense when we're doing science is we have a process of review. And the review process means that other people read your work and they ask questions and make sure that you're saying things that are sensible. So we sign up to review each other's work. So we're sort of aware of what they're doing, and we can say, hey, watch out, pay attention to this, or, you know, so that's how we keep track of each other.
Thank you. I think we've got some questions from the audience now. I think we've got one from Karen. She says, one of the biggest things you can do to reduce your carbon footprint is to have less children. Both Japan and China are encouraging the population to have more children. What can we do about this?
Okay, so that result, which is a result that had a very cool infographic, which is why a lot of people might have seen it, because the infographic was really cool, like having a child is the most carbon impactful thing you can do, is not something that I consider to be scientifically robust. It was part of a review paper where they compared lots of different measures, which sounds like it would make it robust, but if you look into the review paper, there was only one scientific effort where they tried to calculate this. And if you look at that paper, in my view, the basis for that is completely flawed. The basis for that calculation is bunkum. That's my perspective. I am happy to send it to whoever wants to look at it. What it basically assumes is that everybody keeps emitting forever from like we do now. So, which nobody actually necessarily believes is going to be the case. So if we manage to reduce our emissions and turn to societies that are based on sufficiency, which means don't overconsume, consume enough, but don't overconsume, efficiency and renewables, and we transform our economies to zero emission economies, then children will also be zero emissions. So how much emissions children are responsible for is entirely dependent on what we do with our economies and our energy systems. It really depends. So that's one point. I guess the other thing I would like to say is that there, as we saw with the inequality, there are a whole bunch of people out there who pretty much emit nothing. And there are a few people who emit a whole lot more. And in general, that's because we have very unequal societies. If we want to make the world a more equal place, then everybody basically starts having the right to a decent living standard, a nice place to live, stuff, you know, and then everybody's emissions will tend to go up, or their energy use or their resource use will tend to go up, even if it's without emissions. And so in general, it's probably on average more sustainable to not have as many people on the planet as to have more. But that's only if the conditions are equal. So I think that's something else. Yeah. So I think that that's something we can discuss, you know, in terms of population, whose population matters more. It obviously is a lot, you know, the people with the highest emissions are in the US and so North America and Australia and so on. And so obviously, you know, that population should probably come down first if you're trying to care about climate. That's one way to put it.
Yeah, I can see it. Sorry, a very nuanced debate. So yeah, it's careful to make sure you look into these kind of facts before you take one thing. But yeah, all points of view are good to be acknowledged. Would you like to ask another question, Jared?
Yep. So we got a question from Ben King here. He was just asking what are your views on net zero, and do you think it's an excuse to keep fiddling the data and continue to emit greenhouse gases?
Yeah, net zero is so interesting because actually at the beginning, when the term was coined, it was actually coined by a bunch of women activists actually who were really trying to get the governments to move, because everybody was talking about, oh, we'll reduce emissions. And they were like, no, you need to be a lot more ambitious than that. So they actually came up with this term net zero to say, get as close to zero as you can. But then of course, that term was seen as sort of a loophole by the fossil fuel industry. So then it became this thing with like, oh, we can, so the idea behind net zero emissions is that you can cancel out your emissions up into a certain level. So for instance, if you emit a certain, 3 tons of carbon, then you can also have other processes that suck up 3 tons of carbon from the atmosphere through various different mechanisms. The most effective ones probably are being sucked up by plants or by soil. But that became this excuse to say, oh, well, we can emit as much as we want and something else will magically take it out of the atmosphere later on. And so I would say, indeed, net zero started as to being something very ambitious and aspirational and really trying to encourage governments to do a lot more. And it has become something where the fossil fuels industry tends to use it to keep business as usual ticking on, sadly.
Thank you very much. We had another question here from Megan. She was asking about, noticed one of your tweets recently about academic research and activism. The final flowchart was a suggestion about expanding the definition of activism to include other activities like teaching. Do you feel the gap between pure activism and professional responsibilities might be closing? Sorry.
Yeah, so this is my view on this. So first of all, I think that activism is a misunderstood term, because basically activism means trying to change the world from where it currently is, which if you decide that the world is not necessarily in a perfect place, you might be doing a lot of. You might be trying to change your house, your workplace, yourself. You might, you're basically trying to intervene in order to change things. And that doesn't mean that you have to do it in one way or another. There's no rule book that says you must only go on marches and cold signs. That's not the definition of it. It's really about trying to look around you and decide what you would like to do in order to make things better in your perspective of what that is. So I think it can have a very much expanded definition. Changing teaching could be activism, because you're trying to change the teaching system. Changing the schools could be activism. So it can have a very, very broad definition. It's basically just trying to change the world from where it is now. Now, that being said, I have a certain perspective, which is my personal perspective, and I do not expect anybody else to share it, which is that scientists who are doing this kind of research and seeing the world in such a dangerous place have a first responsibility to be out on the streets trying to stop it. So if we're saying that things are so dire and desperate that everything needs to change, and we're just sitting in our nice offices and not actually doing anything, I don't think that we're very credible. So I think in order to be credible, we have to put our feet and our actions where our beliefs are and be consistent. And that means, so I've written multiple papers on this, so it's not a secret. I think that does include, I think there's good arguments for some scientists at least to take the risk to do things like nonviolent civil disobedience.
Thank you. Oh, I think we're getting quite a few questions in now, particularly from staff and students, but I think got to prioritize a few ones from the students. So we've got a question about, what do you think about the idea of having to emit more CO2 before you become clean? So kind of like it's going to get better in the future, like we've got to develop to kind of before we clean up kind of argument. And I guess that might link to, what do you think the economic causes of climate change are?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And there's some, including because it seems like there's some people who believe that because we're emitting CO2 now in order to do things like build solar panels or electric cars, that we will always have to emit it in the future. And that's not the way the world is. So when you're trying to build a new system, of course, you're going to use the building blocks of the old system to get started. But there's more and more work that shows that we can, in fact, transform our whole economies away from fossil fuels and just not use them anymore, so that we can ramp up. One way to think about it is cutting with both sides of the scissor. It's ramping up different types of energy sources. So ramping up renewables on the one hand, because they're cheap and they work and they're super effective. And on the other hand, ramping down demand. So ramping down overconsumption and ramping down wasteful consumption. And just to give you an example of how wasteful our consumption is, which is a perspective you get when you look at the whole energy supply chain, to make electricity out of fossil fuels, we generally waste 2/3 of the energy going in. To drive a car, to go from fossil fuels, so petrol or diesel, to a car driving, you're wasting at least 2/3 of the energy going in. So we can do a lot better than that. We can be a lot less wasteful. UK housing is the worst in Europe in terms of energy efficiency. We can make buildings a lot more efficient. So we can change the way we do things in order to use less. That's one part of the scissor. And then we can ramp up renewables at the other part. So in the meantime, yes, we still have to emit some CO2, but we can, if we were serious about it, we could get off fossil fuels quite fast if we were really serious about it. So it would take a few years, but it wouldn't take decades. But that depends on being serious.
Thank you. I think we've also got a question from some students looking about, do you have any books to recommend on this, what you've been talking about?
Yeah, there are lots and lots of good books. So now we're sort of spoiled for choice. My favorite one is not published yet. I think it's coming out this winter, but it's called The Climate Crisis by, I'm going to get his name wrong, Adam Aron, and it's really good. I think it's like the perfect climate textbook. It has a bit of everything in it. It has graphics, it has interviews, it's just fun. So I had an advanced copy. So I think that that's worth getting when it comes out this winter or this spring. And I think that Bill McGuire recently wrote a book that's quite good. There's also, who else? I'm looking around at my bookcase. There's a beautiful book if you're looking for reasons to keep going, which is All We Can Save, which is a really beautiful book by different people who are trying to change the world around them and keep working on this stuff. So, so it's called Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis, and it's really quite lovely. So you're spoiled for choice these days. There are lots and lots of good books out there, and I can try to think more coherently about which would be the best ones.
Thank you very much. I think we've got another question here for us, from Jenny, and she was asking about how do we persuade the 1% to catch up and get serious about this, and not just thinking buying Teslas and such is a suitable method.
Yeah, I'm afraid that for the 1%, just one Tesla isn't enough. You know, that we're talking about the including people with private jets and all of that. So that's a good question. It's a question in general. So it's actually a really important question, because we did a study on energy inequality and looking at energy uses, and it turns out that the richer you are, the more people use on transport. That's basically it. Poor people use energy to heat or cool their homes and use electricity, and richer people use their excess money on transport, so flying, driving, etc. And the question of what to do about that, I think that it's not a question of convincing. It's not a question of, nicely asking permission, please, can you stop doing very, very destructive activities? In general, in democracies, in liberal democracies, or whatever you want to call them, societies, you don't give people the right to harm you. So somebody's rights to do things stop where your rights not to be harmed begin. And I think that if it's not possible for people to spend money without endangering our current and future life chances, then maybe that type of consumption should not be allowed. So I'm probably more on the radical side of saying things should be outlawed, taxed, so that it's not possible to have this kind of lifestyle. Because, the same way you don't allow people to have a hobby of axe murdering, this is not allowed. The same way we should not allow people to have hobbies of just going around and spewing emissions into the air.
I'd just ask to expand on that. So what would you consider outlawing, like private planes? Would that be an example? Or
for sure, absolutely. I don't think that that's an imposition on people's freedom. And I also think there's no reason to allow things like heavier cars. Right now we have these SUVs, which are cars that are just bigger and heavier than they need to be, and they use a lot of petrol and diesel to do that. So SUVs are the second largest source of increase in emissions in the last decade. All other cars, actually, their emissions went down because car motors are getting more efficient. But because there's so much SUVs, it's really ballooning the emissions budget we have. And I don't see any purpose for that. If you think about the actual use you get out of it, I don't see why we would do that. So I think that outlawing certain types of consumption that are detrimental or unnecessary. I mean, SUVs have all kinds of other problems, including air pollution, including being more deadly in accidents, killing children, all of that stuff. So there's several reasons going on there, but I certainly do not see a reason for those to be associated with, like, oh, my liberty, as my freedom as a consumer depends on being able to buy this stuff.
Thank you very much. I think we're out of time for today. I just wanted to say thank you. I really have enjoyed the talk, and I look forward to having a look at some of these books you've recommended and the climate crisis, which will hopefully come out soon.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute joy. I hope it wasn't boring. or whatever. And it's been really nice to see some of you in person, especially Jess and Meryl, who helped organize this. So thank you so much. And Meryl, if you have a chance to send me your number, and then we can have a chat. Maybe it would just be nice to catch up if you have time. Okay. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much. And that was so thoughtful, so unique. We're so lucky to have had you come to talk to us. I know there were a few questions we didn't quite get to, but well done to Jared and Emily. You were brilliant hosts. It's not easy at all. And there's a lot going on in the background. Thank you, Meryl, as well, from Northumberland, for getting Julia in today. And thank you, everybody, for coming from all over the place to our first event of the year.